The Atlanta Falcons keep signing former Chicago Bears with Ryan Pace now in their front office. And as fun as it is to kind of laugh at them and poke fun at the Falcons becoming Chicago Bears South, it actually could end up helping Ryan Poles in the long term.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. On the show today, we look at the Atlanta Falcons, the Chicago Bears South. The Falcons with Ryan Pace in their front office keep signing recent Chicago Bears. Also Phil Emery in their front office as well. And we'll kind of look at just how big of an exodus there has been down to Atlanta and kind of what that might be signaling from Ryan Pace and sort of how he feels about how things went in Chicago and how he feels about those players in particular. But then also we'll get into how it might just keep helping the Chicago Bears when it comes to the compensatory pick formula. We'll kind of look at where the offseason has gone thus far and how the Bears could get closer and closer to maybe getting a bonus third-round pick next season if things keep going in this direction. And we'll wrap up with a look at positional value in some of these players and how the Bears have valued them in the past, particularly looking at Andy Dalton, how the Bears valued him last offseason, sort of in connection with this Ryan Pace discussion, but then also Matt Nagy maybe throwing some of his weight around compared to how Dalton seems to be viewed by the rest of the NFL. But let's start with the Falcons and the Bears here, because it started as just like a running joke that, the Falcons have signed a couple of Bears players. And now it's becoming kind of eerie that, most recently they just signed Germain Ifedi, the offensive lineman, a couple of days after having just signed Damiere Byrd, the wide receiver. And, in a vacuum, those by themselves, whatever, they happen to sign a couple of former or just recent Chicago Bears players. But now all of a sudden you look at this Falcons roster and it's littered with Chicago Bears. And notice particularly that most of them tend to be on the offense, which is kind of the big point here. But you've got their backfield. Their top three running backs are all former Chicago Bears running backs. Cordero Patterson, Mike Davis, and Damian Williams, who they signed earlier this offseason. On the offensive line, of course, they brought in Germain Ifedi. They had previously brought in Rashad Coward. And this offseason, they also signed Elijah Wilkinson, 3 Ryan Pace offensive linemen for the Atlanta Falcons. And then, of course, at wide receiver now you add Damiere Byrd into that conversation. And you have, even on the defensive side of the ball, James Vaughters is there at their linebacking core. They signed Jalen Tees-Tabor as well in that secondary. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Plus, you have their coaching staff. Their offensive coordinator is Dave Ragone, who was Matt Nagy's quarterbacks coach or was part of this Bears offensive system there. He was the passing game coordinator in 2020 and had been the quarterbacks coach before that, even under John Fox. Their quarterbacks coach, Charles London, was also the Bears running backs coach for a few seasons under Matt Nagy. The Falcons running backs coach, Michael Pitre, was the Bears running backs coach last season, who had replaced Charles London, right? I mean, you kind of just keep going down the list, and there are Bears coaches. Ted Monticino is their outside linebackers coach for them too. Bears coaches, Bears front office people, Bears players across that roster, and it's sort of like you start to wonder, like, why, right? They're not signing all the best Bears players, right? It's not like they traded for Khalil Mack and brought in Danny Trevathan or a key mix or some of these players that actually have played particularly well for the Chicago Bears, but it's been mostly just the Bears sort of, rejects is too strong of a word, because like some of them were starters and some of them had moments of playing well, but for the most part, it's not guys that Chicago Bears fans are really missing, right? You know what I mean? It's not like, oh man, the Falcons got him away from Chicago. I mean, maybe Cordero Patterson would be the one that you'd kind of still like to have, but other than that, it's kind of like, okay, have fun with that. Like it works so well in Chicago, so Ryan Pace wants to recreate that in Atlanta. But the more I thought about it, the more I wonder if like this is sort of his way, and not that Ryan Pace is unilaterally making these decisions, right? He's not their general manager, and neither is Phil Emery, right? They're sort of a part of the conversation here, but it's not their coach, it's not their GM. The GM there, of course, is Terry Fontenot, and Ryan Pace is considered a senior personnel executive there. And for the record, Phil Emery is a national scout for the for the Atlanta Falcons. So like they're not primary decision makers there. But I can't help but get the impression that like if you're Ryan Pace, you're bringing in these guys and saying, okay, my evaluation of these players, I believe, is still correct, even though they didn't play well in Chicago, sort of insinuating then that the coaching staff and the coaching was the problem, right? That Ryan Pace still believes in Jermaine Ifedi, Elijah Wilkinson, Damian Williams, Damiere Byrd as players that he still feels like can contribute positively to his current team, but maybe he feels like coaching staff was the problem and not the evaluating, right? It's like, it's him saying, I wasn't the problem, or trying to prove that he wasn't the problem because he was right about these players and their evaluation. He's going to bring them to Atlanta to show, okay, this coaching staff, even though it has a lot of the same assistants from Matt Nagy's coaching staff, but this coaching staff can bring it out of them and prove that, see, Ryan Pace, actually was right about these players, and it was the coaching staff that made these players not as good, and I'm going to show you in Atlanta that they can be difference makers. I'm not sure that this Atlanta roster, having just traded away Matt Ryan and currently rolling with Marcus Mariota as their starting quarterback, and of course now traded away Julio Jones and lost Calvin Ridley to suspension, right? It's not a very good Falcons roster right now either. That might limit some of those players' abilities to perform, but I just can't help but wonder if this is sending some kind of message of like, I still believe in these players and I can prove it to you, not with Matt Nagy, quote unquote, bringing them down. It'll be fun to watch how they end up doing it with the Bears 2.0, the Atlanta Falcons down there to the Chicago Bears south. But even beyond the fun and the jokes and, you know, the laughter, there's actually, it could be a serious benefit for the Chicago Bears here with the compensatory pick formula. We'll look at where the team stands this offseason and what still needs to happen for them to maybe get an extra third-round pick next year. Next on Locked On Bears. The Masters Golf Tournament is going on right now, and our friends at BetOnline.net are going to be your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information. Tiger Woods has kind of been the big story. We're all excited to see how Tiger continues to do heading into this weekend, if he can pull it off. And our friends at BetOnline are going to be the best place to learn everything you need to know to put some money down and potentially win on golf. It's not just golf, though. BetOnline is your source for all the latest sports developments, the odds, the news, the reviews you need for all the different leagues. The basketball playoffs are really just about here, right around the corner. The play-in tournament is about to start. Major League Baseball just had opening day. You can get odds on how the rest of that season is going to go, plus tennis, soccer, boxing, UFC, even your favorite Vegas casino games online. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we look at Ryan Poles now in Chicago, taking this more patient approach to free agency, I can't help but wonder how much he is intentionally watching the compensatory pick formula situation and playing it slow in that regard to kind of see, okay, how other free agents are signed away and how that might allow him to pick up an extra draft pick in the upcoming draft, and how the Atlanta Falcons so far are significantly helping the Chicago Bears in this process. The actual formula for how the compensatory picks are calculated is complicated and more complicated than I fully understand exactly. I kind of have the gist of it. And to oversimplify it for you briefly, generally speaking, you sort of, every player, when they sign a contract, the compensatory pick formula is weighing, okay, in free agency in a given year, how many of your free agents signed somewhere else and how many outside players did you bring in? And if you lost more than you gained, you get some draft pick or amount of draft pick to compensate for the losses in free agency, thus the term compensatory draft pick. Now, how they calculate how much you lost versus how much you gained is mostly based on how much money each player gets in the contracts that they signed, whether it's the contract the player signed to leave your team versus the contract of the players you signed to join your team. And it's based purely, not purely, but the easiest way to look at it is based on average salary per year. And the more average salary the player signed on their contract, the more weight they carry in the formula to determine whether you deserve a compensatory pick based on your gains and your losses. And so I don't know the exact weighting on each of those, and that's where I say like the formula gets a little bit complicated for me. But fortunately, our friends at overthecap.com track this kind of stuff as it happens and as specifically as contract details come out, because that's when you really start to find this out. And so they kind of have a live updated tracker of what the Bears have gained and what the Bears have lost. And essentially, you know, when a player signs away for a certain amount of money and then a player signs here for a certain amount of money, those kind of cancel each other out. That's when you talk about, you know, the weighting, how much you gained versus how much you lost. And it tends to be a little bit rudimentary, not the over the cap tracking, but the actual formula where sometimes, you know, players that aren't equal in terms of value will still cancel each other out, because at the end of the day, it is still a numbers, like just a sheer like number of players type thing that can sort of end up unfairly punishing teams that sign a lot of players to cheap deals, even if they lost big name free agents to bigger contracts. So when we look at the Bears compensatory pick equation right now, you have the three, not all contracts count towards it. It has to, I think the minimum for a contract to count towards compensatory picks is $3 million a year. And so the Bears have had 4 of their free agents count as that so far. Allen Robinson, of course, gets $15.5 million from the Rams. James Daniels gets just under $9 million from the Steelers. Bilal Nichols gets $5.5 million a year from the Raiders. And then Andy Dalton gets $3 million from the Saints. Those 4 are free agents lost that count against the Bears, or count, I guess, sort of in favor of the Bears in this compensatory pick formula. The players the Bears that have signed that count against them then in this formula: Lucas Patrick, Al-Qadim Muhammad, Justin Jones, Byron Pringle, and Nicholas Morrow. And even though Justin Jones was the one that signed the most for $6 million a year, that still, those 5 still is more than the 4 that they signed away, even though Allen Robinson's deal was worth 15.5 and the most they signed was for 6, those still equal out. And so the Bears are actually in the negative right now in the compensatory pick formula because they've signed 5 and lost 4, and they're left with Nick Morrow, or was kind of the last of the lowest one, unaccounted for in the formula. So right now they've gained more than they're lost, and they're not in a position currently to sign compensatory pick players. But you wonder if how close they could be, because right now we still don't know at the time of this recording on Thursday night what Jermaine Ifedi's contract is going to be. So that's still a to be announced. But if his contract is worth at least $3 million a year, that would bump it up to be a compensatory pick player and count as an equal 5 lost and 5 gained. So then from that point, the Bears would be on even turf. So then if the Bears don't sign any more players for more than $3 million a year, and any other Bears players sign for more than $3 million a year with their new team, the Bears would then get a compensatory pick. And because the Allen Robinson trade, or the Allen Robinson contract, is so much weightier than the rest of them, I'm not positive, but I believe that would be what the Bears would gain, because all the other lower contracts would equalize out more evenly, and it would be the 3rd round pick that they could get for Allen Robinson that would become free. It just takes, in theory, it would require Jermaine Ifedi's contract to be $3 million or more per year, which is real questionable at this stage. Is he going to get $3 million a year from the Falcons? It is Ryan Pace, so maybe, but we don't know at that point. And then they would need one other free agent to sign for $3 million or more to equalize that out. And it can't be the players that they cut, right? It has to be the players that were true unrestricted free agents and not players that you chose to release. So pretty much that leaves you Akeem Hicks, which would seem like a pretty strong candidate to get $3 million or more a year. Also Tashaun Gibson, if he signs elsewhere, although I think he was playing on less than $3 million a year for the Bears on their contract, so I don't know that he would command enough. Jimmy Graham is technically one of these free agents, and I don't know what the heck his value is going to be given what the Bears paid for him last season. But for example, if Eddie Goldman signs somewhere, if Danny Trevathan signs somewhere, if Tariq Cohen signs somewhere, they won't count towards this formula because the Bears released them and didn't let them, they didn't expire on contracts. They were free agents by the Bears' choice, not just by the contracts running out. So there's a chance here, right? And maybe it's a team like the Atlanta Falcons that wants to bring in another former Ryan Pace player and give them a little bit more money and put the Bears potentially over the top on the compensatory pick formula if Jermaine Ifedi, right? So right now the Bears need two more to go over the top. Maybe Ifedi can be one, maybe Hicks can be the other, or potentially Jimmy Graham if a team is willing to still pay him a lot of money at 35 years old, but given how close he was to retirement in previous years, I don't think that's likely to happen. The other factor in here is the timeline, because I believe the date in which free agents no longer count towards this formula is May 3rd. It's basically after the draft, any free agent that you sign, even the more money, no longer counts in the compensatory pick formula, so you're free to sign as many as you want. And so if Akeem Hicks doesn't sign until after then, it won't count to the formula. But conversely, any players the Bears sign after then won't bring down their potential compensatory picks, which is part of why I'm wondering if maybe Ryan Poles is playing that longer game right now and is planning more to sign players after the draft, after he sees what he's able to get in the second and third rounds in particular, and still potentially set himself up to get some kind of compensatory pick next season if more of his players sign with other teams. It's been interesting to see how other teams have valued some of his players. And I think the Andy Dalton situation is really a microcosm of how the Chicago Bears have sort of misevaluated or misvalued players compared to the rest of the NFL. And we'll kind of touch on his contract and the Matt Nagy, Ryan Pace power struggle and where else we could see that same kind of trend continue next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars ever. They're called Built Bars, and they truly are something you can't find anywhere else on the protein bar market. I've tried a bunch of different kinds of protein bars in my day. I like to get good protein. It helps build muscle. And when I go to the gym, I love to have a Built Bar after my workout because Built Bars taste like candy bars. They're soft and they're easy to chew. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. And the Brownie Batter Built Puff that I have right now might be the best product that they've ever put out. But all flavors of Built Bars are low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. And I promise you cannot find a protein bar product on the market that tastes this good and is this good for you at the same time. It is a guilt-free sweet treat that really satisfies my sweet tooth, that's for sure. You got to try it for yourself. Head on over to Built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. As the new Bears regime evaluates their own players and makes all the turnover and really kind of puts their own stamp on these guys and seems to have some very different opinions about what these players are worth compared to, how the previous regime valued them. I've also been keeping an eye on how other teams value some of these players compared to how the Chicago Bears valued some of these players. And the microcosm of this for me, I think, is Andy Dalton. And we can kind of dive into that a little bit, but I think it's not exclusive to Andy Dalton in the sense that I think the Bears gave Elijah Wilkinson more money even than what the Atlanta Falcons are giving him this season. I think we've seen a couple of their guys over the course of time, haven't seen the Bears value them the same way that other teams seem to have valued some of their free agents. Even like Artie Burns got less money from the Seahawks this year than what the Bears had paid him to come to Chicago originally. But in particular, and Damian Williams too, I think, with the Falcons. But Dalton in particular stands out to me when it's so clear how much he was paid the year before he came to Chicago, how much he was paid by Chicago, and how much he's paid now the year after Chicago. Because he played his whole career at the Bengals or whatever, kind of got injured at the end. I can't even remember off the top of my head if he was ultimately released or if he became a free agent or how his eventual departure from Cincinnati was formally taken on the books. But that first year after he left the Bengals, he'd been a starter his whole career. He'd been a playoff guy, right? And we kind of thought like in that 2020 offseason that he could be a potential starting option for a team. There was a lot of quarterback movement that year because I think that was the year Tom Brady first left for the Buccaneers. That was the year Phillip Rivers went to the Colts. There were a couple others. There was a lot of quarterback movement, and the Bears traded for Nick Foles that year as well. And we kind of thought like, well, Dalton's a starting caliber quarterback, and I think Alex Smith was out there too. Like he likely end up somewhere to compete, right? And ultimately, no one seemed to actually want him to compete to be a starter. So he signs with the Dallas Cowboys on a 1-year, $3 million deal. That was what seemed like at the time, given Dalton's previous performances in Cincinnati, as really good value as a strong quality backup, right? I mean, like, you're not expecting Dalton to come in and be great, but to be one of the better backup quarterbacks there. And of course, ends up playing over half that season for the Cowboys and, completed 65% of his passes and 14 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. He was putting up just under 200 yards a game. So not like spectacular, but had a couple of, fourth quarter comeback game-winning drive type plays at the end there. And of course, this all is partially what generates the Chicago Bears' interest in him, or fuels more of the Chicago Bears' interest in him, to the point where the team signs him that offseason, of course, last season, 1 year, $10 million, more than 3 times as much what the Cowboys were paying him the year before. And the Bears said, you know what, we're going to make him our starting quarterback. QB1 gets tweeted out week 1 and all that. And even after we draft Justin Fields in the first round, Matt Nagy and I, the organization, we still feel like Andy Dalton is our guy, and we are sticking with Andy Dalton as our starting quarterback. And of course, we all saw what happened. He wasn't god-awful, but he was not very good, and of course, kind of fizzles out and all that. But again, we go into this offseason with a bunch of teams with quarterback needs, a bunch of quarterback movement again, with Deshaun Watson being traded, Russell Wilson being traded, Carson Wentz being traded, Baker Mayfield still waiting to be traded, Matt Ryan being traded, and Jimmy Garoppolo still sitting out there. And the Falcons end up signing Marcus Mariota, and he's kind of their quarterback plan right now. And they're still the Texans don't have like great options at quarterback right now either, and it's like, well, there could be potentially an opportunity for Dalton there, but again, nobody wants him, at least as a starting quarterback, and he goes to the New Orleans Saints on, again, a 1-year, $3 million deal. He got the exact same contract from the Saints in terms of value that he got from the Dallas Cowboys the year before the Bears. So it seems like the Bears were the only team that was really willing to go out, pay him big money, and make him that starting quarterback, because plenty of teams had the option to in 2020, and plenty of teams had the option to in 2022. And in either case, right, it's not as though like Dalton built up huge value with the Cowboys in 2020 to where the Bears would want to pay him that much and then lost all that value again. Like, he was still he didn't have a great season his last year in Cincinnati, but like, it wasn't as though he was worlds better in Dallas, right? I mean, it was still kind of like the same. He's kind of been the same Andy Dalton for a long time now, right? If you put a really good team around him, he can do some stuff. And if you don't have a very good team around him, he's going to be pretty bad. And yet the Bears seem to be the only team that was seemed to be the only team that valued him so highly and then paid him so much to make him that starting quarterback. And it just seems like a misvaluation, not only on Andy Dalton, which is kind of the obvious thing, but like a misread of the quarterback market and how much you needed to pay to secure the services of someone like Andy Dalton. And it's the same kind of thing we saw with Jimmy Graham, where I'm like, he hasn't signed with another team yet, and he might still retire, and we might not get a great answer to this, but the Bears signed him to a 2-year, $16 million contract when it really didn't seem like teams were lining up to spend that kind of money at the tight end position at all, let alone for the, what was he, 34, 33 years old at the time when they signed him. Like the Bears gave him a similar contract to like what he had gotten from the Packers before. Like he was making, I think like $10 million a year over 3 years with the Packers, and he got $8 million a year over 2 years with the Bears. Like it was a step down, but it seemed to be clearly at the time we could all tell it was an overpay, right? We were on this podcast, and many people in the Chicago media were critical of the signing when it happened, and we all kind of said, wow, that seems like a major overpay for Jimmy Graham, and the production more or less bore that out, and it just kind of speaks again to like how the team seems to continually or seemed to misevaluate the value of players. I mean, you can go back to Mike Glennon getting $15 million a year, right? Were other teams lining up to give Mike Glennon $15 million a year? And I think that's where I can gain some appreciation now then for Ryan Poles' more patient approach. And I don't know, could you put Larry Ogunjobi in that conversation? Were teams lining up to give Larry Ogunjobi $13 million a year? I mean, we don't know yet. We'll see if he signs another prove-it deal and has a big year and then gets a big contract next offseason, then maybe that amount will be justified. Still to be determined. But you can kind of see where it is nice to not be rushing out to overpay players or misevaluate these players in terms of contract value compared to the rest of the NFL. It's not to say that like the Bears should have known Dalton would be that bad or should have known that Graham should have been that bad. It's just more about like you should know, or you should in theory have a pretty good sense of like what the market is and what other teams are willing to pay and not drastically overpay based on that. And it was just another one of these things that's more of the Ryan Pace criticism than the Matt Nagy criticism, because it's more Pace's job. You can criticize Nagy for picking the quarterback and how the quarterback played, or same with the tight end, like for more the on-field results. But Ryan Pace seemed to be more the like contract negotiation and market valuation stuff that didn't seem to go particularly well. And Ryan Poles hasn't been willing to pay $15 million a year for Allen Robinson, or pay almost $9 million for James Daniels, or pay only like $4.5 million for Bilal Nichols, right? He hasn't really been willing to potentially overpay, or just not willing to spend that much money for those types of players, and instead going a little bit on the cheaper side and a little bit on the more patient side here. We'll see how that actually takes the form of results on the field. But for now, it's an interesting trend to watch. It's something we'll definitely be keeping an eye on, along with that compensatory pick formula and any and all Bears that continue to go to the Atlanta Falcons right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, baseball season's underway, and the Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day for all of your favorite MLB teams, plus the Bulls in the playoffs. Locked On Bulls have you covered there as well, and so much more. So I hope you'll keep tuning in to Locked On Bears throughout the offseason. We're not going anywhere, even when the Bears are taking it slow and steady. We're still here chugging away, and I hope as a result that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.